Hi folks, Dan Crouch from DH Crouch Marine. My channel is very new, and the first video I ever put up was edited painstakingly again and again and again with Windows built-in media software. It didn't go very well, and I added in some rather annoying repetitive music. I've since just tweaked it. I've taken that out, and I'm starting to find a bit of a format here. So basically, it's the same video. It's pretty much the same length, same commentary, but I've taken annoying music out. So here's a story of how we got Angel Boat 2 fixed. But the works here carried out on Angel 2, which is a boat club based at Angel Islington. The craft is currently skippered by Phil Gavigan, a super nice chap who was actually here on this operation. The works to be carried out here was the final part of an ongoing operation to rectify transmission issues. So the craft has a midship installation of engine, which means the engine is in the middle of the boat, or far more forward towards the bow. It's a Beta 50 horsepower with a PRM 260D2 gearbox. The works I'd carried out prior to this operation was to change the drive plate, which had completely fallen to pieces, and have the aqua drive system re-engineered or remanufactured. A new one had to be done, and the thrust bearing had to be rebuilt by TW Marine, which we really appreciate. Did a fantastic job on it too. The works here is simply now to access the propeller shaft and the propeller. So here I'm simply loosening off the propeller nut with a socket and bar to allow me to withdraw the propeller shaft. If you look carefully, you should have been able to see the propeller wobbling off axis. That's just how bad this shaft had become. The craft was built in the 90s, so it's provided a very good service life. However, some point someone has actually introduced copperies into this propeller greaser, and that would definitely act as a kind of grinding paste. So don't ever use copperies on in your grease. You want to use a proper marine grease like K99. So simply I'm using a block of wood to stop the propeller from spinning, give me a point of locking. It's fairly straightforward operation. There's always a scary factor of shearing off the tip of the shaft. If it's an old piece of equipment, you can afford to be a little bit more of a £100 gorilla and kind of get on with the job, because it's all being replaced anyway. But one does try to be considerate, even with old equipment. So behind me there's the red box. In a minute you'll see that I can be a right clumsy git and drop things. And right about now. Yeah, that was silly. Should have just closed the box and carried it, but there you go. We do silly things. So that box actually got a 10-ton hydraulic puller. The idea that is it's got various combinations in there for lengths of leg and methods upon which to pull something. So the video just jumps because the editing software I use is pretty basic. But I set up to try space on the board there, getting the puller ready and checking which leg would be longest to use and would make the job as efficient as possible. Some instances you need a lot of heat to get propellers that have been on a shaft for 20 odd years, but so far I found that this hydraulic puller works really well. I've yet to have a stubborn propeller that won't come off with it, but perhaps I've said it now and it will happen, so we'll see. So I'm simply setting up the hydraulic puller, setting up the legs to go on the tri-point hub, which is the centre part of the puller. The hydraulic puller is simply a long steel tube with a threaded rod which winds in, and that presses down on the hydraulic fluid, then it acts against the piston to create a hydraulic action which would push out a piston, and this then would create a pulling action against the legs. So it's designed for pulling off bearings or sort of cylindrical objects off of shafts and other such things. It's proven to be quite a useful tool. I've managed to use it in other such ways, to like a mini portable press in small jobs, which has been quite handy. I'm simply there just putting the bolts through the legs. Unfortunately, the camera's on the wrong side for you to see that. So I'm just carrying on, just adjusting the hydraulic puller for setting up. Takes a little bit of time. It's a fiddly bit of kit, but once it's assembled, it creates a very effective pulling tool. Now you can see the three, I think that was the medium legs I had on this kit. So the boss on this three-pointed propeller is on a taper on the shaft. So the taper on the shaft would obviously create a point where it pinch up as it gets tighter by the nut which has been removed. And over the years that can become like very comfortable and doesn't want to budge at all. So hammering it just isn't really going to do that, and using a hammer can often distort the main boss on the propeller. This propeller does have some dinks, and one of the blades is bent back ever so slightly, but you know, leaving hammer marks on something, if you can avoid it, is definitely a good idea. Sometimes it's unavoidable, I must admit, but if you can find a tool to achieve a job in a more efficient fashion, then definitely choose the right job for the job. So there I'm just tightening up the bolts on the legs on the puller, just to ensure that it's a rigid fixture and it's reducing the amount of movement in the wrong places. Okay, so now I'm locating the centre of the puller on the tip of the shaft and ensuring that the legs for the puller can fit around the boss and it can grip it at the back. So I'm probably adjusting the length of where the hydraulic ram is going to meet the tip of the shaft, and I've got various spacers to try and make that job more efficient and more practical. So there I've just put one of the tips of the extension that would fit on the ram of the puller. So once the legs are in place, you simply do up the thread on the puller body, the piston body of the hydraulic ram mechanism, and that allows it to get a simple mechanical fixing, and then you use the hydraulic effort to start to pull on the propeller. So this gets to be quite dramatic once the force of the hydraulic puller overcomes the taper. And keep watching, and bang, and pops off with a bit of fun. I think I probably said something like exciting. So that's me just seeing if the key would come out, but I think the key on that particular shaft was definitely embedded into the keyway. So that's stage one out of the way. At this stage now I'm sort of considering which way round to do things. In some instances you can move the propeller shaft just slightly, that you can see the propeller there is taken a bit of a battering, but for 20 years use it's actually not bad. I've seen propellers in far worse a state than that. So withdrawing the propeller shaft from the stern tube you can't just pull it straight out because you've got a rudder in the way. Even if you used to straighten the rudder up, you've still got it dead centre. Sometimes they can bypass because the boat wasn't built square, if you might say. The old saying goes, nothing on a boat is straight. Sometimes that can actually play to your advantage, but in this instance it wasn't going to be the way. Part of the job here was to improve the rudder cup in the skeg, because there's a lot of rattle there, creating a very unpleasant navigating experience for whoever's skipping the boat. Consequently, the swan neck bearing at the top had failed completely. All that was left was the outer and inner races. There was no ball supporting the bearing at all anymore. So here I'm just putting the tool that I've used, which is the hydraulic puller, away, so I shouldn't be needing it for this job anymore. And then I'm just sort of, whilst doing that, sort of looking up and having a think about how I'm going to take on the next step. So here we see the top end of the tiller. So we can see the boss of the swan neck with the swirl pattern, or the stripe pattern. You just see the yellow and the green at the top there. So I'm going to use a Allen key to take out the grub screw from the centre bearing race. The idea here is to free up everything to start looking at withdrawing the rudder blade, shaft and the bearing itself. Now, what I had determined quite quickly was that taking the swan neck boss off, because some of you may have a bolt which fixes it into the shaft, to get that boss off, 9 times out of 10 you need a lot of heat. The puller unfortunately won't get in underneath the swan the way that it curves. It's just not enough room, and of course heat would allow it to expand and you can obviously lift it off. But because of the work I'm doing below, end up having to cut off the rudder, which you'll see later. I figured the simplest, more efficient thing to do would be to leave the swan neck alone, because it's a good fit, it wasn't any play in it. Pull the whole shaft out and actually clean off the old weld from where the blade gets cut off eventually. And that allowed me to actually knock off the old bearing. And unfortunately the video didn't pick up when I did that, but the bearing had been replaced beforehand and the old inner race of the bearing had been pushed down the shaft. So I found it quite amusing finding someone else's dirty remnants, as you might say. So that's just my 2-ton bottle jack. Very useful tool. I use it for a number of different jobs, but this is just me sort of playing around with a few ideas to try and be as efficient with my time as I can. The dock booking here was a cancellation, which had been offered to me when I'd asked for requested a booking at ASAP to do this work for this boat club. Of course, when you get a booking, you need to be in and out there as quickly as possible because you only get a limited amount of time. The prominent figure you can see there is Mr. Gavigan, the skipper. So I'm using the jack here to actually help force the bearing to come up away off of the studs, which are holding on the actual top of the boat there. It had been on there some years and it didn't want to just come off. So what you can't see here is just me loosening everything off at the bearing on just below the swan neck at the top of the tiller, just preparing myself for I think at this point Paddy, who runs the dock, along with Alan Brimfield, was having a chat to me, and Phil, just making sure Phil was accommodated and had everything he needed to crack on and do what jet washing he needed to do and blacking preparations. Yeah, compliments to Paddy. He's very accommodating, always likes to make sure people are happy there. Also, a big thank you to Marcia, who manages the bookings. I really appreciate her assistance in making this booking possible and allowed us to carry out the work in January. So again, I'm just playing with ideas in my head here of just which way around I'm going to do things. And at one point I was considering just cutting a little piece out of the top of the blade there, just to try and allow myself to lift up the rudder. The priority at this stage is simply getting that shaft out and the equipment off up to the machinist, which is Clement's Engineering, just to try and get this job going as fast as possible. And there I'm just sort of, with my finger, I'm pointing out, marking out where I might cut the blade off. I figured that would be the quickest and most efficient way, as again, going back to removing the bearing up above the blade here and below the swan neck, without upsetting the boss on the swan neck. It would just prove to me to be much simpler to cut the rudder off. And anyway, I'm just referring to the cup at the bottom bearing. Basically, just I'm gonna eventually I end up just pushing it to reduce some of the rattle in there as much as possible. This is just where I'm getting my 240 grinder out to begin cutting operations. Just on the side note here, something to make people aware of. Prior to this work, the Angel boat had a new galvanic isolator fitted, but it was one of the better quality units. There's a Victron unit, which is the galvanic isolator, which prevents any physical contact between the craft and any shoreline connections, which is the best way of protecting the hull from galvanic corrosion, along with the anodes that you have. But to note, just what we did notice on the hull when walking around the boat was points of pitting, and clearly where the hull would have been subject to galvanic attack, if you might say, because there wasn't any galvanic protection on this boat that I was aware of when I looked at the electrics beforehand. But prior to this, this having that unit fitted was definitely a really good idea. The blacking, I believe, had only been done a few months before this visit, so this was just a top-up coat they were going to do whilst you're there, sort of thing. Make sure your anodes are in good condition, and if you've got a shoreline hookup, you definitely need to have some level of galvanic corrosion protection. Now the next operation we are getting prepared for here is the cutting of the rudder off the shaft. It did prove to be the most efficient way to think ahead, carry out the operation in a swift and efficient process, because there was more than one operation going on with removing the shaft. As I say, there's the bearing at the top. I think the idea I had here with the jack was to pin the rudder against the counterplate, just to make it less of a chance of the whole thing falling on me whilst cutting. But just a rule of thumb with when using tools, not to be aggressive with the tool, and to allow it to work and to do the work you're using it for. I use 1mm cutting discs in most operations of cutting steel with grinders, and I find them to be very efficient at cutting through metal or whatever material you need in a really efficient fashion. But you must allow it to work, and don't force it through. You can't make it work any quicker than it can, so otherwise you can damage the tool or yourself if you're not careful. Consequently, you may note that I do have PPE on here, gloves, glasses, and ear protection. Definitely important to have. Unfortunately, the camera has only the outer casing on when I did that. So here I'm trying to cut as close to the shaft as possible to remove as much material to allow the shaft to remain as round, which I'd like to have to grind round a bit anyway. The idea being is that I've got a bearing or an old remains of the old bearings to come down the length of the shaft from below the swan neck once I withdraw the whole thing off the boat. So whenever you're cutting, try to remove as little material as you can, because I do still have to weld this back on later. So bear in mind that I value my tools quite a lot, so I use the block of wood here to attempt to protect my jack from the sparks. I don't particularly want any hot metal or sparks, should I say, to impregnate themselves on the ram of the jack, which can easily happen, and that would damage the seal and then make the jack useless. So it's more just to kind of make the to protect the jack, the bit of wood, rather than it doing anything more than that. So because of access and the shape of the grinder and the means of cutting, I had to change the dynamic of the angle grinder by adjusting the guard on it, making it more possible to actually get in. I think I may even had to just remove the guard here, which, to be honest with you, is really not a good thing to do, but there just isn't any other way of doing that with a grinder. So again, just taking your time, making sure things can't move on their own, hence the jack pinning the rudder up against the Uxter plate, allowing me to work as safely as possible, and taking your time, being patient. So repositioning here to allow me to cut the opposite side of the rudder, because the disc could only penetrate through so far because of the shape of the head of the grinder and the curvature of the shaft. So yeah. Now I'm just checking to see if the cut has managed to work its way all the way around the shaft, which is welded into the blade there. I think at this point I was satisfied. Now I'm just clearing the tools out of the way to allow the next operation. Oh, another cut. No, that's it. Dropping the rudder there to allow me to get to the last top bit and not cut into the actual hull of the boat, which would be very bad to do. And there you go. One rudder-free boat. And the complimentary free removal of fishing line. Okay, we've moved into the inside of the craft at the stern, and this shows the inside of the just in front of the weed hatch. So you've got the aqua drive thrust bearing just to the left of the screen, and then you've got the propeller shaft with the stern gland. The lighting wasn't brilliant in there. I did have a torch and various other lights, but it just for some reason was proving to be a bit of a pain getting light in there, but it does come clear enough for you to see in a moment. So simply I'm undoing the cap head bolts which were torqued correctly in sequence when I was installing this equipment. So all I'm doing here is using a ratchet on a socket set with a hex drive and just simply loosening the 6 hem cap screws. To note actually, until the propeller shaft was replaced, the thrust bearing, which is bolted to a plate which creates a separate chamber for any drips from the stern gland, normally are mounted on rubber bushings, but they were stripping the rubber bushings frequently because of the sheer amount of wear that the propeller shaft had. So the short-term solution I'd come up with was using M12 bolts and fixing it solidly to the plate, which proved to allow the boat to operate within a relative parameter of safety and comfort until these works could be carried out. But ultimately the thrust assembly would actually be remounted back on the soft bushings again to allow for a much smoother system. But here we're simply removing the old shaft and the gland and the bushing. So here I'm loosening up the glammed flange. One of the primary reasons for doing this when taking a shaft out is, over the years, as you tighten up the gland packing, it actually starts to cut into the shaft and creates a groove. Effectively, that can then become a lock to stop the shaft being able to move up and down the stern tube. And in some instances, that can actually create a place for water to bypass, and no matter how much you tighten your gland up, it can actually leak water in. This one wasn't much better than that. It was fairly leaky, to be fair. I'm just removing the greasing tube from the greaser. So at the back here there's 4 bolts which keep the stern gland bolted onto a plate, which stops that rotating and undoing and allowing it to simply disassemble itself whilst you're cruising along. So undoing those bolts, preparing myself for withdrawing the shaft and then being able to disassemble the gland and the tube. Ratchet spanners have a lot to be said for them. They are incredibly useful tools. Their life expectancy isn't anywhere near as good as a typical solid steel spanner, but they can make short work of an awkward access point, and on boats they really are just the most useful tools to own. Again, I'm working against the clock on this particular day, just trying to get everything disassembled so I can get on the road and get up to the machinists. And that should be all the bolts from the stern gland removed now. And just a reminder that the 4 bolts on the gland to stop that from rotating and undoing itself whilst you're cruising along. So the next operation will be to begin removing the shaft out of the stern of the boat. But I think finalising here would be just to make sure the shaft's free from the thrust bearing coupling, which has the 6 cap head screws loosely in now. I believe I end up loosening off the 2 bolts which keep the thrust bearing on the plate. I can do those just to give myself more wiggle room to play. You know, if anything you're doing in a job can make your job easier and more efficient, then definitely do it, even if it makes it more work for yourself. Trying to take shortcuts and make a job easier when it's not going to get you anywhere faster is just pointless. And I'm just making sure each cap head screw is as loose as possible without taking them all out. Well, in fact, I think I have taken them out here just to make sure there's no room for binding of anything. Then rotating for the other set of 3. And a little bit of cleaning up of the grease splatter just to make the operation a little bit cleaner. I find that cleaning things up as much as possible when working prevents you getting covered in grease, and then prevents all your tools, your van and yourself being covered in oil and grease. I got accused of being a very clean engineer once, and I was quite chuffed when that happened. One of my high points. And as discussed before, that's me undoing the M12 bolts which keep the thrust assembly in place. They needed to be taken out permanently anyway, because I'd have to install the whole thing with the correct bushings later. This was just a temporary measure to prevent any excess rattle, because the old shaft is wobbling around in the old stern tube so much it would potentially have damaged the brand new aqua drive system. And this actually allowed me to push the shaft out, making the job a bit easier. And that kind of aggressive twist and back just help it to come away from the shaft. A little bit of work and a little bit of effort there just makes the whole job a bit smooth and a bit easier, with minimal impact on all the other equipment around. I'll spare you from the jokes of engineering puns. I'm sure you've all heard them before. and that's the shaft being withdrawn from the outside. It took a little bit of back and forth action there just to free it up of the stern gland. And now I'm just taking out some of the packing, because that was proving to be a problem getting the shaft out. So as I suspected, the shaft had developed a deep groove where the packing had been binding over the years and been over tightened, and it was stopping the shaft being withdrawn. Again, if you can do something without damaging anything and it makes the job easier, take the time, do it, make your life easier. And we've now jumped to much the same operation, around about the same timings, withdrawing the shaft from the craft. So one more sort of going up and down, in and out, just making sure everything was free. This is where a second pair of hands can be helpful sometimes, but I tend to work alone, so. Again, with any operation, it's just patience, persistence, think baby steps, don't get angry, don't get frustrated, just go and check, see what's going on, get an idea of both sides of the story, and then work the problem, taking your time, ensuring that you're not causing a further problem down the line. So there, I've probably gone in and taken out some of the packing, as you saw in the previous slide. So here I'm just coming back now to finalise withdrawing the shaft. And the little clean bit in the middle there is where the packing would be binding, and that's what would have caused the shaft to not be free. So that concludes taking the old shaft out. The stern gland and the old bearing would have come out by simply unscrewing it counterclockwise. And this just shows us how poor and how worn out the old gear was. You can see that wobble there. It's just absolutely beyond use now. It's causing all sorts of problems and damage to the equipment, but it had provided good service life. So the previous video just was a compliment to the machinist that actually produced that new bushing and tube. The old one was oval, so the machinist had to try and guesstimate the correct thread diameter, pitch, and within the time frame that he had, managed to produce a fantastic fit to the steel boss, which is welded to the hull. So compliments to Michael. Hopefully you're watching this video and you approve and you're good at what you do. So as you see here, it's the new shaft being inserted. That's a nice snug fit. And here we are basically tightening up the nut, or the new nut, which was different to the old one. And the spanner there was actually the spanner that was hanging up inside the dock at the workshop. I'd spotted that and thought it'd be quite nice to grab that and use it on the on tightening up the new nut, and it was the perfect fit. And you can see the propeller there is actually the old propeller. There simply wasn't time to get a new propeller organised, so I'd reprofiled the tip of the blades or the leading edges and gave it a polish and took all the scale off just to give it a bit more service life. Long term, I think the propeller needs changing, but it's proven to be fine for the time being, and there's no major concern at this stage. So the machinist at Clements Engineering had produced a nice new locking tab. So once the nut was tight, it's just a question of banging the tab over the cross flats on the nut just to create a locking tab, and that prevents the nut from undoing itself. So again, just using the wood to create a point of locking the blade, allowing me to put some torque on that nut. And if you remember when I said I was pulling off the old, pulling off the propeller before, you're using the taper and you're bolting it against it. So there's some much picture slides just to show you the new parts that were machined up, just to give you an idea. The reliefs in there to allow for play. So that's the old gland that's been reconditioned and polished up. And that concludes the work on Angel 2. Thanks for watching.